Welcome. My name is Opubo Benebo. Operating a landmass as a farm, whether subsistence farm or large-scale industrial farm, requires watering the farm as needed because life requires water to survive. So a necessary next step after the preparation of any vacant parcel of land into a farm is the implementation of a mechanism for provisioning water to the farm. In effect, a water resource must be decided upon and appropriate means implemented to ensure the consistent supply of source water to the farm. In synopsis, this episode, entitled Provisioning Farming Source Water Delivery, addresses the considerations of mechanisms for provisioning water to subsistence farms, the availability of the mechanism, and the factors impacting the choice of a mechanism. As per the operational plan in readying the subsistence farm, the dispensing of water on the produce is set to flow from the water storage tank. But that presumes that water is already in the tank. So then the water had to have been fetched from a source and delivered and be stored in the storage tank before the water can be dispensed onto the produce of the farm. Water could, in fact, be fetched for the delivery from a natural body of surface water, such as river, a stream, lake, or even ocean. It could be fetched from non-surface water such as aquifers, underground lakes, and pools, or from cave lakes and rivers and streams, and from atmospheric condensation sources such as rainwater. Each of these sources has specific characteristics and so requires differing methods of delivery of the water to the farm. However, certain conditions influence even the mere consideration of a water source for provisioning water. One necessary condition for a water source to be deemed operational for a specific farm content for consistent delivery of water to a farm on demand basis is that the source water support a degree of availability that may qualify it to be deemed as a virtual reservoir. Yet, some of the sources of water as delineated would not qualify as virtual reservoir, being variable in availability and as such introduce variability to the provisioning of water for the farm. Safety of access is also a condition of consideration in the designation of a water source as contextually available for provisioning of water to the farms. Then all such water sources that does not meet the virtual reservoir qualification or is hazardous to access must necessarily be omitted from further consideration. Such is the case with rainfall water source, which does not assure continuous availability. After all, rainfall is not under the control of the farmer, but rather happens only when Mother Nature deems it so. Agreed that with the exception of accessing groundwater fed by aquifers, access to all other delineated water sources may present a level of innate associated risk of access, in which case the consideration becomes a matter of relative risk. In this regard, then, the surface water source of river presents the least access risk. Of course, this position exports the matter of distance access risk into the considerations of transportation mechanisms of the delivery method. So, for all intents and purposes, the decision-making process is limited to considerations of hazards innate to a water source within the environs of the farm. Obviously, then, underground lakes and pools and cave lakes and rivers pose the most hazard, unless well established as having a history of regular and safe human access. Consequently, the consideration of delivery method will include the non-surface water sources on the subsumption that there is one of each kind in the environs of a farm that has well-established history of regular and safe human access. Then, of course, admittedly, source water reservoirs of surface water source may not be readily found on land, so the specification as a viable source water becomes further constrained to the choices that reduce to only those water sources of which the available volume of water relative to the farm watering needs qualifies the source as satisfying the requirement of virtual reservoir. However, for the average farmer, the choice specification also depends on the available funds for investing in the subsistence farm, as well as in the implementation of the delivery associated mechanisms of the currently actively accommodated water sources. Besides the virtual reservoir status and limited finances of the farmer, other natural conditions also impact the selection of a water source for use in provisioning water to a farm. For instance, while the well seems to be the most proximate, given the disposition to always dig the well by the farm, the distance factor may also still apply just as well to well source water, even though the most effective of these sources of water would seem to be the well, in the mistaken assumption that the well can just be dug and provisioned with a borehole right in the farm, or proximate at least. Of course, admittedly, the exclusion of the opportunity enabling mere disposition to simply dig a well by the farm may also be applicable in those circumstances in which the farm is not in an arid region, but in a desert, in which case the land is usually with water, but only at a reasonably far enough depth. Otherwise, the well may end up being placed at a far enough distance to suffer the distance considerations as well. Seas and ocean water sources also have limiting conditions of use, which in this case is determined by the financial state of the farmer. With the exception of when the farm is on a floating support in the middle of surface reservoir of seas and oceans, access to water from these sources, even when complemented with industrial-scale desalination process when in saline sources, would be excluded and are not considered, as the farmers engaging on subsistence farming are usually in no financial position to undertake such offshore projects. This circumstance therefore limits surface water sources to mostly rivers. In any event, in view of the cost factors that keeps creeping into the considerations, making an informed decision about the choice of source water delivery method being adopted would have to be guided by analysis based on some form of cost comparison. Generally, cost of source water is variable and increases with increasing distance from the farm. As observed, there are two main tasks that get performed that are common to provisioning water from all water sources: the fetch task and the transporting task. So the cost comparison will have to be based on the sum of the costs associated with the performing of these two primary tasks. In that regard, the approach to evaluating the total cost is to collect and sum all the costs of each method while expressing the distance factor as an algebraic relation or expression into which the distance can simply be plugged in each case for the comparison, and then perform a graphical plot of the functions on a cost versus distance plot with the object of selecting the least expensive method of delivery. Reiterating, when access to any water reservoir is assured, there are two main tasks that get performed in the process of delivering water to a subsistence farm: fetching the water from the farm and transporting the water to the farm. So then, the assessment of the contributions of these factors in the costs associated with the performing of these tasks requires the evaluation of the cost of performance of each of the tasks, as the sum makes up the overall delivery expense in the order of performing the tasks. the deployment of technology in performing any of these tasks significantly impacts productivity and cost, though sometimes inversely. However, the operational technology availability is directly impacted by the context of the farming, rural versus non-rural. The assessment of the impact of the two tasks should be instructive in ultimately invariable application of the task-specific cost in the evaluation of the overall cost. First up for consideration then is the fetch mechanism. Irrespective of the rural or non-rural context of the farm, fetching the water from a water reservoir entails the development, meaning the design and implementation of a fetching technology, which therefore provides a base cost assessment. However, because there can be different technologies for accomplishing the task, a brainstorming of the technologies need be conducted to discover as many approaches as possible, and each method then assessed for the cost of performance. Next up is the consideration of the transportation task. Each of these various water sources would also require a transportation technology for transporting the water so fetched to get the water to the farm for storage in the water storage tank. Further, with assessing the cost of transportation, there is also a base path preparation cost of making the path to the water source be of the quality of regular and safe human access standard. In addition to preparation of the distance factor of transportation that is significant, in addition to the driver technology in itself. And so the distance of transportation is a cost moderator. As noted prior, an algebraic representation of the distance contribution to the cost somewhat simplifies the analysis, and so an effective approach would be to best represent the cost as dependent on unit distance. This approach is actually very apt for those who are mathematical inclined, as the representation enables the application of paid approximation for a much more rapid evaluation of the comparison. Equally notable is that the transportation mechanism also could take several forms. Yet, the various possible forms mostly obtained from two mechanisms of transfer, the two broad mechanisms being with pipe-borne transport and transport by storage tank. Of both cases, though, the most readily attainable means of water transportation would entail the use of storage tanks. The analysis as such would be performed over the shortlisted water sources: river, a stream or lake, and groundwater. Outreach should start with addressing each water source. So we're starting off with groundwater accessible by well, calls attention to particular note, though, that well water is not a surface ground water, but rather an in-ground reservoir. This adds a certain outlier fixed cost to the access cost evaluations without regard to the distance access cost. So the cost of well water has a constant that is an outlier of access cost for the in-ground source, and that brings in the matter of access cost, evaluating the outlier constant cost related to well water access, and the rest on the consideration on the choice of construction of well, making available the source of water. And several options would be in order, which includes option 1, being the task of digging regular well to depths where the water table is breached. Option 2, drill holes that are no more than 6 inches in diameter and with double piping system. For the regular well constructed by digging into the ground, the fetching technology variations consist of the traditional bucket fetch mechanism and suction pump mechanism. The bucket fetch mechanism can be of the ancient art of using buckets, consisting of lowering the buckets into the well and then scooping up a bucket full and pulling the bucket of water to ground surface level. The cost assessment of this mechanism, while seeming to be the same as the cost of the bucket, in fact, there is the labor cost of performing the fetching, and then there is also the cost of the non-use of the labor directly on the farm, as would be if such labor needs were not being performed, which would constitute a sort of opportunity cost. However, for the 6-inch diameter drill holes, the fetching technology may use a forced suction method entailing the use of pumps, whether these be hand pumps, rectilinear pumps, or circulatory pump, rotary pumps. Implementing a pump use technology always entails the inserting of a smaller pipe inside the borehole pipe extending down into the water and then cut slightly above ground level, to which is then affixed any type of the listed pump. For a hand-operated pump, the water is pulled up to the surface with repetitive up pulling and down pushing of a lever mechanism of the pump. The evaluation of the cost of this fetch mechanism also includes labor costs, just as with the dog well water fetch mechanism, together with the associated opportunity cost. For all non-hand operated pumps, the pump is connected to an electrical power source from which electromotive force drives the mechanism of the pump, resulting in the suction of the water from the well up into the ground surface level. These two approaches effectively define the basis of fetch mechanism cost assessment method for well water delivery to subsistence farms. For surface water, the fetching technology can be source specific and also be much more varied. Manual fetch, circulating wheel, bucket scoops, hydrostatic siphon pump, pressure differential Bernoulli flow, and suction pump. The mechanism of the design as implemented for each concept will vary. The principles are the same, and so best discussing the principles perspective. The manual fetch is nothing more than the age-old approach of getting to the edge of the water source and then scooping up a bucketful at a time. The circulating bucket fetch technology has a design similar to water wheel, with the paddles replaced with buckets for scooping up water. The hydrostatic siphon pump simply uses pressure differential between the depth-driven hydrostatic pressure in the source water and the surface pressure to drive up the water to the surface. The pressure differential Bernoulli flow through, though similar to the hydrostatic siphon pump in principle, actually uses the pressure differential between the hydrostatic flow inlet pressure of the moving water source and the land surface pressure to drive water to the surface. The suction pump mechanism simply inserts a tube in the water source to a predefined depth and then power up the pump to induce a suction flow of the water from the end of the tube in the water source up to the end of the tube at the surface ground level. For water sources of cave, lakes, and river, the mechanism is a choice of the mechanisms already delineated for well water and ground surface water sources. For a cave lake, a hole can be drilled into the ground until breaching the cave roof and down to the water. As it were, the lake is a natural well water, and the water fetched by any of the pump mechanisms. Of course, if the water source has an established, regular, and safe human access history, then the method of hydrostatic siphon pump can also be used as access, because access to the lake could be safely made to submerge the driver drum. Cave rivers. For cave rivers, the fetch mechanism can also use the pressure differential Bernoulli flow on the basis of safe accessibility of the river. The circulating bucket fetch mechanism can also be deployed, in this case for fetching and bringing the water to above and then emptying the water into a bucket in a reservoir basin. For all of these fetch mechanisms, the transportation mechanism mostly probably would be the pipe mechanism, which would have the fetch mechanism, discharge end affixed to a pipe, which will have a pump connected between the length of the transportation from the fetch discharge point to the water storage tank in the farm. Two considerations are important here: the selection of the pipe size and the form of the pump to be deployed for the pumping. The deployment of powered pumps will introduce the additional consideration of the provisioning of electric power to the pump, and for assurance constancy of such power supply, the electric power may have to be generated in the farm and then transmitted to the pump by appropriate design transmission system. The water transportation mechanism by use of storage tanks, however, is likely to be more commonly used given the relatively larger population of subsistence farms being not often implemented by skilled people, and also the paucity of these farmers being financially well-heeled. Transport by storage tank, however, will also significantly impact the productivity because the farmers get directly involved in the transportation, as become obvious presently. And this expenditure of time in the transportation definitely introduces opportunity costs in terms of time, and hence cuts into the potential productivity realizable otherwise. The contribution of the opportunity cost, of course, may be evaluated through the relationship cost is equal to productivity minus performance cost, where the opportunity cost is absorbed in the performance cost, which gets lower as opportunity cost is reduced. So given the need to minimize the opportunity cost associated with transport by storage tanks in view of distance is involved, the means of transportation available to the farmers becomes a factor. The options, though, for actually moving water-filled storage tanks are several, and to some extent dependent on whether the subsistence farm is in a rural community or urban. The local or domestic transportation most common to all regions of the world are of two types: vehicular transport of sorts and animal and manual labor-enabled displacements. The basic cost of transportation by storage tanks as such deserves being made on the basis of these choices. This option brings into focus the rural versus non-rural context of subsistence farming and the prevailing endemic regional transportation mechanisms. Obviously then, the rural subsistence farmer options are different from those of the non-rural farmer. Indeed, the only common denominator differentiator is the ownership of a vehicle, which will enable the use of the vehicle to continually transport water to the farm using the storage tank after being filled with water. The use of vehicular transportation has such cost consideration as actual vehicle cost, automobile insurance, gasoline cost, and maintenance cost or cost of wear and tear. The reality is that rural communities tend to move loads using such locally available load transportation options such as cows and horses and donkeys and what have you. Then, of course, the rural subsistence farmer who may not own vehicular transportation means of any form may end up using the animal and labor-assisted transportation means. Because the use of transport storage tanks can be supported on rolling contraptions, and being so placed on the contraption, the actual form or design of the rolling contraption and the means of effecting the motion of the contraption will be driven by the forms of technology available in the community. Yet the choices are driven by technology, mostly mechanized transportation means available or not to the farmer. Such will entail the use of carts and modern wooden improvised wagons, which indeed entails long performance times and correspondingly large opportunity cost. Clearly, the time to travel is so high as to reduce the productivity while still keeping the performance cost constant in a best-case scenario. But even that may increase due to inefficiency derivative of performance exhaustion. Of course, there is a net financial benefit in using pipe-borne water delivery for the net gain in opportunity cost as per the relation, which is that the benefit is equal to the sum of the opportunity cost minus investment capital. Where the opportunity cost may be evaluated is as shown presently, and the investment capital is the cost of the implementation of the pipe-borne delivery system, including the operating cost per unit volume. Indeed, for more realistic comparison, the cost needs to be reduced to a unit volume per unit time of some choosing. So, the rural subsistence farmer who has the same choice will invariably readily employ these same means to accomplish the water transportation challenges. Therefore, prioritizing by availability of technology and then making the choices accordingly. The graphical analysis could be performed, starting with the plotting of each of the delivery methods. Obviously, there could be an intersection point for some fetching methods and for others none at all. So note should be made of all the cost functions for which there are intersection points and then select the minimum, so to say. Summarily, even the cheapest means may not necessarily be adopted as a matter of context. The non-rural farmer may have a car or have access to rent one for each day. The rural subsistence farmer, though, to whom no mechanized transportation means is available, must transport the water by employing various endemic rural means of transportation. Though not much mentioned of the operating of the farm as a grain subsistence farm has been made, such is readily attainable when the object is to implement a green farm. The source of the electric power invariably has to be of green technology in origin. On that note, I say to you, thank you so much for being here, for having come to listen to this observation about efforts aimed at elevating world hunger through subsistence farming by both urban dwellers and emergent country small farm farmers. You are truly appreciated. If you would like to get a privileged viewer, reader information, access podcasts of specialized contents, or even vertically integrated contents, then I also implore you to join my supporter club and enjoy that privilege status. Thank you. While still here, do please take a moment and subscribe to the channel as to be informed of the publication of every new episode as soon as it is released. Bye. Till next episode.